All right, live streaming. Hi, everyone. This is Shinga, Speaker of Stars. Um, so, I guess it's been a while since my first reading session on December 3rd, 2024, of the book Andromeda, A Space Age Tale by Ivan Yefremov, who is from 1907 1972, well known Soviet scientist, professor of paleontology, and a talented writer of science fiction. Andromeda is a novel about the future of mankind. It depicts with truly fantastic scope the unparalleled bloom of science technology and the rise of a new social order, and portrays the universe in the so called era of the Great Circle, where Earth will have constant communication with space. So, this book was written in 1956 on the eve of the first attempts at space exploration, when the word cosmonaut still was just science fiction, of course, So, um, on the day of the launching of the first Earth satellite, readers congratulated Yefremov on the dawning of the era of the Great Circle. Um, so today is December 22nd, 2024. Like I said, I've actually, Megan lent me this book quite a while back ago, probably around March this year. And to be frank, I've barely read it. So maybe in a way, doing this live stream is a way for me to read it for, not just myself, but for anybody who's interested. Classic Soviet science fiction, like I said, you can find the PDF link or you can buy it online. So I was reading chapter 1 a few weeks ago. I'm going to read chapter 2 now. And I'm also going to actually try to see as far as I can get. I'm supposed to return this book tomorrow to her. So I'll see how far I can get. If I don't finish this, I'll just go buy my own copy later. Chapter 2, Epsilon Tucanae. The faint tinkle of glass that came from the table was accompanied by orange and blue lights. Vari-colored lights sparkled up and down the transparent partition. Dar Vector, director of the outer stations of the Great Circle, was observing the lights on the spiral way. Its huge arc curved into the heights and scored a dull yellow line along the seacoast. Keeping his eyes on the way, Dar Vetter stretched out his hand and turned a lever to point M, ensuring himself solitude for meditation. A great change had on that day came into his life. His successor, Mivin Mas, chosen by the Astronautical Council, had arrived that morning from the southern residential belt. They will carry out his last transmission around the circle together, and then it was precisely this then that had not yet been decided upon. For 6 years, he had been doing a job that required superhuman effort, work for which the council selected special people, those who were outstanding for their splendid memories and encyclopedic knowledge. When attacks of complete indifference to work and to life began recurring with ominous frequency, and this is one of the most serious ailments in man, he had been examined by Evda Nall, a noted psychiatrist. A tried remedy, sad strains of minor music in a room of blue dreams saturated with pacifying waves, did not help. The only thing left was to change his work and take a course of physical labor, any sort of work that required daily, hourly, muscular effort. His best friend Veda Khan, the historian, had offered him an opportunity to do archaeological work with her. Machines could not do all the excavation work. The last stages required human hands. There was no lack of volunteers, but still Veda had promised him a long trip to the region of the ancient steppes where he would be close to nature. If only Veda Khan, but of course he knew the whole story. Veda was in love with Erg Nor, member of the Astronautical Council and commander of Cosmic Expedition number 37. There should have been a message from Erg Nor from the planet Zerda. He should have reported and said whether he was going farther. But if no message had come and all space flights were computed with the greatest precision, then but no. He must not think of winning Veda's love, the vector of friendship. That was all. That was the greatest tie that there could be between them. Nevertheless, he would go and work for her. Dar Vetter moved a lever, pressed a button, and the room was flooded with light. A crystal glass window formed one of the walls of a room situated high above land and sea, giving a view over a great distance. With the turn of another lever, Dar Vetter caused the window to drop inwards, leaving the room open to the starry sky. The metal frame of the window shut out from his view the lights of the spiral way and the buildings and lighthouses on the seacoast. Vedder's eyes were fixed on the hands of the galactic clock with 3 concentric rings marked in subdivisions. The transmission of information around the Great Circle followed galactic time, once in every 100,000th of a galactic second, or once in 8 days, 45 times a year, according to terrestrial time. One revolution of the galaxy around its axis was 1 day of galactic time. The next, and for him, the last transmission would be at 9 a.m. Tibetan Mean Time, or at 2 a.m. at the Mediterranean Observatory of the Council. Little more than 2 hours still remained. The instrument on the table tinkled and flashed again. A man in light-colored clothing made of some material with silk-like sheen appeared from behind the partition. "We are ready to transmit and receive," he said briefly, showing no outward signs of respect, although in his eyes one could read admiration for his director. Darth did not say a word, nor did his assistant, who stood there in proud, unrestrained pose. "In the cubicle hall?" asked Vetter last, and getting an answer in the affirmative, asked where Mivin Mas was. "He is in the morning freshness room, getting tuned up after his journey, and apart from that, I think he's a bit excited." "I'd be excited myself if I were in his place," said Darth Vader thoughtfully. "That's how I felt 6 years ago." The assistant was flushed from his effort to preserve his outward calm. With all the fire of youth, he was sorry for his chief. Perhaps he even realized that someday he too would live through the joys and sorrows of great work and great responsibility. The director of the outer stations did not in any way show his feelings, for to do so at his age was not considered decent. "When Mivin Mas appears, bring him straight to me." The assistant left the room. Darth Vader walked over to one corner where the transparent partition was blackened from floor to ceiling, and with an easy movement opened 2 shutters and panel of polished wood. A light appeared, coming from somewhere in the depth of a mirror-like screen. It did not, however, possess the gloss of a mirror. It gave the impression of a long corridor leading into the far distance. Using selected switches, the director of the outer stations switched on the vector of friendship, a system of direct communication between people linked by the ties of profound friendship that enabled them to contact each other at any moment. The vector of friendship was connected with a number of places where the person concerned was likely to be: his house, his place of work, his favorite recreation center. The screen grew light, and in the depth there appeared familiar panels with columns of coded titles of electronic films that had succeeded the ancient photocopies of books. While all mankind adopted a single alphabet, it was called the linear alphabet because there was no complicated signs in it. It became easy to film even the old books, so that eventually the process was fully mechanized. The blue, green, and red stripes were the symbols of the central film libraries where scientific research works were stored, works that have for centuries been published only in a dozen copies. It was merely necessary to select the code numbers and symbols, and the film library would transmit automatically the full text of the book. This machine was Veda's private library. A snap of switches and the picture faded. It was followed by another room which was also empty. Another switch connected the screen with a hall in which stood a number of dimly lighted desks. The woman seated at the nearest desk raised her head, and Darth Vader recognized the thick, widely separated eyebrows and the sweet, narrow face with its gray eyes. As she smiled, white teeth flashed in a big mouth with bold lines, and her cheeks were chubbily rounded on either side of a slightly snub nose with a childish round tip to it that made the face gentle and kindly. "Veda, there are 2 hours left. You have to change, and I would like you to come to the observatory a little before time." The woman on the screen raised her hands to her thick ash blonde hair. "I obey, my Vetter," she smiled. "I'm going home." Vetter's ear was not deceived by the gayness of her tones. "Brave Veda, calm yourself. Everybody who speaks to the Great Circle has to make a first appearance." "Don't waste words consoling me," said Veda Khan, raising her head with a stubborn gesture. "I'll be there soon." The screen went dark. Darth Vader closed the shutters and turned to meet his successor. Mivin Mas entered the room with long strides. The cast of his features and his smooth dark brown skin showed that he was descended from African ancestors. A white mantle fell from his powerful shoulders in heavy folds. Mivin Mas took both Darth Vader's hands in his strong, thin ones. The 2 directors of the outer space stations, the new and the old, were both very tall. Vader, whose genealogy led back to the Russian people, seemed broader and more massive than the graceful African. Interesting racial history here. "It seems to me that something important ought to happen today," began Mivin Mas, with that trusting sincerity that was typical of the people who lived in the era of the Great Circle. Darth Vader shrugged his shoulders. Important things will happen for 3 people. I am handing over my work. You are taking it from me, and Beta Khan will speak to the universe for the first time. She is beautiful, responded Mivamass, half questioning, half affirming. You'll see her. By the way, there's nothing special about today's transmission. Beta will give a lecture on our history for planet KRZ 664456 plus BS 3252. Mivamass made an astonishingly rapid mental calculation. Constellation of the Unicorn, star Ross 614. Its planetary system has been known from time immemorial, but has never been in any way distinguished itself. I love the old names and old words, he added with a scarcely detectable note of apology. The council knows how to select people, Darth thought himself. Aloud, he said, then you get on well with Junius Antis, the director of the electronic memory machines. He calls himself the director of the memory lamps. He's not thinking of the lamps they used for light in ancient days, but those first electronic devices in clumsy glass envelopes with the air pumped out of them, they look just like the electric lamps of those days. Mivamass laughed so heartily and frankly that Darth Vader could feel his liking for the man growing fast. Ha! Okay, that was not really his laugh. That was my lame attempt. All right. Memory lamps. Our memory network consists of kilometers of corridors furnished with billions of cell elements. He suddenly checked himself. I'm letting my feelings run away with me and haven't yet found out essential things. When did Ross 614 first speak? 52 years ago. Since then, they have mastered the language of the Great Circle. They are only 4 parsecs away from us. They will get Veda's lecture in 13 years' time. And then, after the lectures, we shall go over to reception. We shall get some news from the Great Circle through our old friends. Through 61 Cygni. Of course, sometimes we get contact through 107 Opiechi, to use the old terminology. A man in the same silvery uniform of the Astronautical Council as that worn by Vedder's assistant entered the room. He was of medium height, sprightly and aquiline-nosed. People liked him for the keenly attentive glance of his jet black hair. The newcomer stroked his hairless head, which I have a lot of hair, so this is... Okay, anyways, like that. I'm Junius Antis, he said, apparently to Mivamass. The African greeted him respectfully. The director of the memory machines exceeded everybody else in erudition. They decided what had to be perpetuated by the machines and what would be sent out as general information were used by the palaces of creative effort. Another brevis, muttered Junius Antis, shaking hands with his new acquaintance. What's that? Inquired Mivamass. A Latin appellation I've thought up. I give that name to all those who do not live long. Vita breva, workers on the outer stations, pilots of the interstellar space fleet, technicians of the spaceship engine plants, and, you and I. We do not live more than half the allotted span either. What can we do? It's more interesting. Where's Veda? She's intended coming earlier, began Dar Vetter. His words were drowned by disturbing chords of music that followed a loud click on the dial of the galactic clock. Warning for all Earth, all power stations, all factories, transports, and radio stations. In half hour from now, cease the consumption of all energy and accumulate it in high-capacity condensers until there is enough for a radiation channel to penetrate the atmosphere. The transmission would take 43% of Earth's power resources. The reception would need only 8% for the maintenance of the channel, explained Darth Vader. That's just as I imagined it would be, said Mivamass, nodding his head. Suddenly his glance became fixed and his face glowed with admiration. Darth Vader looked around. Unobserved by them, Veda Khan had arrived and was standing beside a luminescent column. For her lecture, she had donned the costume that adds mostly to the beauty of women. A costume invented thousands of years ago before, at the time of the Great Civilization. The heavy knot of ash blonde hair piled high on the back of her head did not detract from her strong, graceful neck. Her smooth shoulders were bare, and her neckline was cut very low, revealing a high bosom supported by a corsage of cloth of gold. A wide, short silver skirt embroidered with blue flowers exposed bare, sun-tanned legs and slippers of cherry-colored silk. Big cherry-colored stones brought from Venus, set with careful crudeness in a gold chain, were like balls of fire on her soft skin, and matched cheeks and tiny ears that were flaming with excitement. Mivamass met the learned historian for the first time, and he gazed at her in frank admiration. Veda lifted her troubled eyes to Darth Vader. Very nice, he said in answer to his friend's unspoken question. I have spoken to many audiences, but not like this. She said, "The council is following a custom. Communication for the different planets are always read by beautiful women. This gives them an impression of the sense of the beautiful as perceived by the inhabitants of our world. And in general, it tells them a lot," continued Darvetter. "The council is not mistaken in its choice," exclaimed Vivimas. Veda gave the African a penetrating look. "Are you a bachelor?" she asked softly, and acknowledging Vivimas's nod of affirmation, smiled. "You wanted to talk to me?" she asked, turning to Darvetter. The friends went out on the circular veranda, and Veda welcomed the touch of the fresh sea breeze on her face. The director of the outer stations told her of his decision to go to the dig. He told her of the way he had wavered between the 38th Cosmic Expedition, the Antarctic submarine mines, and archaeology. "Anything but not the Cosmic Expedition!" exclaimed Veda, and Darvetter felt that he had been rather tactless. Carried away by his own feelings, he had accidentally touched a sore spot in Veda's heart. He was helped out by the melody of disturbing chords that reached the veranda. "It's time to go. In half an hour, the Great Circle will be switched on." Darvetter took Veda Khan carefully by the arm, accompanied by the others who went down an escalator to a deep underground chamber, the cubic hall, carved out of living rock. There was little in the hall but instruments. The dull black walls had the appearance of velvet divided into panels by clean lines of crystal. Gold, green, blue, and orange lights lit up the dials, signs, and figures. The emerald green points of needles trembled on black semicircles, giving the broad walls an appearance of strained, quivering expectation. The furniture consisted of a few chairs and a big blackwood table, one end of which was pushed into a huge hemispherical screen, the color of mother of pearl set in a massive gold frame. Veda Khan and Vivimas examined everything with rapt attention, for this was their first visit to the observatory of the outer stations. Darvetter beckoned to Vivimas and pointed to high black armchairs for the others. Sorry, I'm just seeing how far longer this is. Okay, yeah, like 20 pages. The African came towards him, walking on the balls of his feet, just as his ancestors had once walked in the sun-baked savannas on the trail of huge savage animals. Okay, that sounds slightly racist. Just a side commentary. Maybe not. All right. Vivimas held his breath. Out of this deeply hidden stone vault, a window would soon be opened into the endless spaces of the cosmos, and people would join their thoughts and their knowledge to that of their brothers in other worlds. This tiny group of 5 represented terrestrial mankind before the whole universe, and from the next day on, he, Vivimas, would be in charge of these communications. He was to be entrusted with the control of that tremendous power. A slight shiver ran down his back. He had probably only at that moment realized what a burden of responsibility he had undertaken when he had accepted the council's proposal. And he watched Darvetter manipulating the control switches, something of the admiration that burned in the eyes of Darvetter's young assistant could be seen in his. A deep, ominous rumble sounded, as though a huge gong had been struck. Darvetter turned around swiftly and threw over a long lever. The gong ceased, and Veda Khan noticed that a narrow panel on the right-hand wall had lit up from floor to ceiling. The wall seemed to have disappeared into the unfathomable distance. The phantom-like outlines of a pyramidal mountain surmounted by a gigantic stone ring appeared. Below the cap of molten stone, patches of pure white mountain snow lay here and there. But Vivimas recognized the second highest mountain in Africa, Mount Kenya. Again, the strokes of the gongs resounded through the underground chamber, making all present alert and compelling them to concentrate their thoughts. Darvetter took Mavin's hand and placed it on a handle in which a ruby eye glowed. Mavin obediently turned the handle as far as it would go. All the power produced on Earth by 1760 gigantic power stations was being concentrated on the equator, on a mountain 5,000 meters high. A multicolored luminescence appeared over the peak, formed a sphere, and then surged upwards in a spear-headed column that pierced the very depth of the sky. Like the narrow column of a whirlwind, it remained poised over the glassy sphere, and over its surface, climbing upwards, ran a spiral of dazzling, brilliant blue smoke. The directed rays cut a regular channel through Earth's atmosphere that acted as a line of communication between Earth and the outer stations. At a height of 36,000 kilometers above Earth, hung the diurnal satellites, a giant station that revolved around Earth's axis once in 24 hours and kept in the plane of the equator so that to all intents and purposes stood motionless over Mount Kenya in East Africa. Yeah, that's really interesting. It's talking about geosynchronous satellite, which I'm pretty sure did not exist yet then. The point that had been selected for permanent communication with outer stations. There's another satellite, number 57, revolving around the 90th meridian at a height of 57,000 kilometers and communicating with the Tibetan Receiving and Transmitting Observatory. The conditions for the formation of a transmission channel were better at the Tibetan station, but communication was not constant. These two giant satellites also maintained contact with a number of automatic stations situated at various points around Earth. The narrow panel on the right went dark. It signaled that the transmission channel had connected with the receiving station of the satellite. Then the gold-framed pearl screen lit up. In center appeared a monstrously enlarged figure that grew clearer and then smiled with a big mouth. This was Gor Han, one of the observers on the diurnal satellite, whose picture on the screen grew rapidly to fantastic proportions. He nodded and then stretched out a 10-foot arm. Okay, seems like an alien. 10-foot arm. To switch on all the outer stations around our planet. They were linked up in one circuit by the power transmitted from Earth. The sensitive eyes of receivers turned in all directions into the universe. The planet of a dull red star in the Unicorn constellation that had shortly before sent out a call had a better contact with Satellite 57, and Gor Han switched over to it. This invisible contact between Earth and the planet of another star would last for 3/4 of an hour, and not a moment of that valuable time could be lost. Beta Khan, at a sign from Dar Vetter, stood before the screen on gleaming round metal dais. Invisible rays poured down from above and noticeably deepened the suntan of her skin. Electron machines worked soundlessly as they translated her words into the language of the Great Circle. In 13 years' time, the receivers on the planet of the dull red star would write down the incoming oscillations in universal symbols, and if they had them, electron machines would translate the symbols into the living speech of the planet's inhabitants. That's kind of interesting. I wonder what these universal symbols look like. All the same, it is a pity that these distant beings will not hear the soft, melodious voice of a woman of Earth and will not understand its expressiveness, thought Dar Vetter. Who knew how their ears may be constructed? They may possess quite a different type of hearing. But vision, which uses that part of the electromagnetic oscillations capable of penetrating the atmosphere, is almost the same throughout the universe, and they will behold the charming Vetter in her flush of excitement. Question I have for this: would these aliens have the same sense of beauty as humans do? I mean, this seemingly, it seems like this book assumes so, because otherwise they would choose a beautiful woman. They would seem, anyways. All right. Dar Vetter did not take his eyes off Veda's tiny ear, partly covered by a lock of hair, while he listened to her lectures. Briefly but clearly, Veda Khan spoke of the chief stages in the history of mankind. She spoke of the early epochs of man's existence, when there were numerous large and small nations that were in constant conflict owing to the economic and ideological hostility that divided their countries. She spoke very briefly and gave the era the name of the era of disunity. People living in the area of the Great Circle were not interested in lists of destructive wars and horrible sufferings or the so-called great rulers that filled the ancient history books. More important to them was the development of productive forces and the forming of ideas, the history of art and knowledge, and the struggle to create a real man. The way in which the creative urge had been developed in the people had arrived at new conceptions of the world, of social relations, and of the duty, rights, and happiness of man, conceptions that had nurtured the mighty tree of communist society that flourished throughout the planet. Well, clearly, as we can see here, communism, in whatever vein here, has triumphed as a form of utopia. Okay, I'm going to stop interjecting my comments. During the last century of the era of disunity, known as the Fission Age, people had at last begun to understand that their misfortunes were due to a social structure that had originated in times of savagery. They realized that all their strength, all the future of mankind, lay in labor and the correlated efforts of millions of free people, in science, and in a way of life reorganized on scientific lines. Men came to understand the basic laws of social development, the dialectically contradictory course of history, and the necessity to train people in the spirit of strict social discipline, something that became of greater importance as the population of the planet increased. In the Fission Age, the struggle between old and new ideas had become more acute and had led to the division of the world into two camps, the old and the new states with different economic systems. The first kinds of atomic energy had been discovered by that time, but the stubbornness of those who championed the old order had almost led mankind into a colossal catastrophe. The new social system was bound to win, although victory was delayed on account of the difficulty of training people in the new spirit. The rebuilding of the world on communist lines entailed a radical economic change accompanied by the disappearance of poverty, hunger, and heavy, exhausting toil. The changes brought about an economy made necessary an intricate system to direct production and distribution, and can only be put into effect by the inoculation can only be put in effect by the inculcation of social consciousness in every person. Communist society had not been established in all countries and amongst all nations simultaneously. A tremendous effort had been required to eliminate the hostility and especially the lies that had remained from the propaganda prevalent during the ideological struggle of the fission age. Many mistakes have been made in this period when new human relations were developing. Here and there, insurrections have been raised by backward people who worshiped the past and who, in their ignorance, saw a way out of man's difficulties and returned to that past. With inevitable persistence, the new way of life has spread over the entire earth, and the many races and nations were united into a single, friendly, and wise family. Thus began the next era, the era of world unity, consisting of 4 ages: the age of alliance, the age of lingual disunity, the age of power development, and the age of the common tongue. Society developed more rapidly, and each new age passed more speedily than the preceding ones. Man's power over nature progressed with giant steps. In the ancient utopian dreams of a happy future, great importance was attached to man's gradual liberation from the necessity to work. The utopians promised man an abundance of all he needed for a short working day of 2 or 3 hours, and the rest of the time he could devote to doing nothing. To the dulce far niente of the novelist, this fantasy naturally arose out of man's abhorrence of the arduous, exhausting toil of ancient days. People soon realized that happiness can derive from labor, from a never-ceasing struggle against nature, the overcoming of difficulties, and the solution of ever new problems arising out of the development of science and economy. Man needed to work to the full measure of his strength, but his labor had to be creative and in accordance with his natural talents and inclinations, and it had to be varied and changed from time to time. The development of cybernetics, the technique of automatic control, a comprehensive education, and the development of intellectual abilities coupled with the finest physical training of each individual made it possible for a person to change his profession frequently, learn another easily, and bring endless variety into his work so that it became more and more satisfying. Progressively expanding science embraced all aspects of life, and a growing number of people came to know the joy of the creator, the discoverer of new secrets of nature. Art played a great part in social education and in forming the new way of life. Then came the most magnificent era in man's history, the era of common labor consisting of 4 ages: the age of simplification, the age of simplification, the age of realignment, the age of the first abundance, and the age of the cosmos. A technical revolution of the new period was the invention of concentrated electricity with its high-capacity accumulators and tiny electric motors. Before this, man had learned to use semiconductors and intricate weak current circuits for his automated cybernetic machines. The work of the mechanic became as delicate as that of the jeweler, but at the same time it served to subordinate energy on a cosmic scale. The demand that everybody should have everything required the simplification of articles of everyday use. Man ceased to be a slave of his possessions, and the elaborations of standard components enabled articles and machines to be produced in great variety from a comparatively small number of elements in the same way as a great variety of living organisms is made of a small number of different cells. The cells consist of albumins. The albumins come from proteins and so on. Feeding in former ages have been so wasteful that its rationalization made it easy to feed, without detriment, a population that increased by thousands of millions. All the forces of society that had formerly been expended on the creation of war machines, on the maintenance of huge armies that did no useful labor, and on propaganda and trumpery, were channeled into improving man's way of life and promoting scientific knowledge. And that sounds absolutely beautiful. It's like a utopia. I wish this world could become like that. Anyway, at a sign from Veda Khan, Darvetter pressed a button, and a huge globe rose up beside her. We began, continued the beautiful historian, with a complete redistribution on Earth's surface into dwelling industrial zones. The brown stripes running between 30 and 40 degrees of north and south latitude represent an unbroken chain of urban settlements built on the shores of warm seas with a mild climate and no winters. Mankind no longer spent huge quantities of energy warming houses in winter and making himself clumsy clothing. The greatest concentration of people is around the cradle of human civilization, the Mediterranean Sea. The subtropical belt was doubled in breadth after the ice on the polar caps had been melted.
To the north of the zone habitation lie prairies and meadows where countless herds of domestic animals graze. The production of foodstuff and trees for timber is confined to the tropical belt, where it is 1,000 times more profitable than in the colder climatic zones. Ever since the discovery was made that carbohydrates, the sugars, could be obtained artificially from sunlight or carbonic acid, agriculture has no longer had to produce all man's food. Practically speaking, there is no limit to the quantities of sugars, fats, and vitamins that we can produce. For the production of proteins alone, we have huge land areas and huge fields of seaweed at our disposal. Mankind has been freed from the fear of hunger that had been hanging over it for tens of thousands of years. One of man's greatest pleasures is travel, an urge to move from place to place that we have inherited from our distant forefathers, the wandering hunters and gatherers of scanty food. Today, the entire planet is encircled by the spiral way, whose gigantic bridges link all the continents. Veda ran her finger along a silver thread that turned the globe around. Electric trains move along the spiral way all the time, and hundreds of thousands of people can leave the inhabited zone very speedily for the prairies, open fields, mountains, or forests. Alas, the planned organization of life put an end to the murderous race for higher speeds, the construction of faster and faster vehicles. Trains on the spiralway proceed at 200 kilometers an hour. Only on rare occasions do we use aircraft with the speeds of thousands of kilometers an hour. A few centuries ago, we made extensive improvements to the surface of our planet. The energy of the atomic nucleus has been discovered long before, in the fission age, when man learned to liberate a tiny part of his energy to produce a burst of heat, but with the harmful radiation in the fallout. It was soon realized that this meant danger to life on the planet, and nuclear power possibilities were greatly curtailed. Almost at the same time, astronomers studying the physics of distant stars discovered two new ways of obtaining nuclear energy, Q and F, that were more effective than old methods and involved no harmful radiation. These two methods are now in use on Earth, although our spaceships use another form of nuclear energy, the NMSM fuel, that became known to us from our observations of the great stars of the galaxy through the Great Circle. It was decided to destroy all the stocks of thermonuclear materials that had been accumulating a long time, radioactive isotopes of uranium, thorium, hydrogen, cobalt, and lithium, as soon as a method of ejecting them beyond Earth's atmosphere had been devised. In the age of realignment, artificial suns were made and hung over the north and south polar regions. These greatly reduced the size of the polar ice caps that had been formed during the ice ages of the Quaternary period and brought about extensive climatic changes. The levels of the ocean was raised by 7 meters, the cold fronts receded sharply, and the ring of trade winds that had dried up the deserts on the outskirts of the tropic zone became much weaker. Hurricanes and general stormy weather manifestations ceased almost completely. The warm steppelands spread almost as far as the 60th parallels north and south, and beyond them the grasslands and forests of the temperate zone past the 70th parallels. 3/4 of the Antarctic continent was freed from ice and proved to be a treasure house of minerals that were invaluable because resources on the other continents have been almost completely exhausted by the reckless destruction of metals in the universal wars of the past. The spiral way was completed by carrying it across the Antarctic. Before this radical change in climate had been achieved, canals had been dug and mountain chains that had passages cut through them to balance out the circulation of air and water on the planet. Even the high mountain deserts of Asia have been irrigated by constantly operating dielectric pumps. The potential output of foodstuff had grown very considerably, and new lands had become habitable. The frail and dangerous old planet ships, poor as they were, enabled us to reach the other planets of our system. Earth was encircled by a belt of artificial satellites from which scientists were able to make a close study of the cosmos. And then, 808 years ago, there occurred an event of such great importance that it marked a new era in the history of mankind, the era of the Great Circle. For a long time, the human intellect had labored over the transmission of images, sounds, and energy over great distances. Hundreds of thousands of the most talented scientists worked in a special organization that still bears the name of the Academy of Direct Radiation. They involved methods for the directed transmission of energy over great distances without any form of conductor. This became possible when ways were found to concentrate the stream of energy in non-divergent rays. The clusters of parallel rays then provided constant communication with the artificial satellites and therefore with the cosmos. Long, long ago, towards the end of the era of disunity, our scientists established the fact that powerful radiation streams were pouring onto Earth from the cosmos. Caused from the cosmos and the transmission around the great circle of the universe were reaching up together with radiation from the other constellations and galaxies. At that time, we did not understand them, although we had learned to receive the material signals, which we, at that time, thought to be natural radiation. Kam Amat, an Indian scientist, got the idea of conducting experiments from the satellites with television receivers and with infinite patience tried all possible wavelength combinations over a period of dozens of years. Kam Amat caught a transmission from the planetary system of the binary star that had long been known as 61 Cygni. There appeared on the screen a man who was not like us, but was undoubtedly a man, and he pointed to an inscription made in the symbols of the Great Circle. Another 90 years passed before the inscription was read, and today it is inscribed in our language, the language of Earth, on a monument to Kam Amat. Greetings to you, our brothers, who are joining our family. Separated by space and time, we are united by the intellect in the circle of great power. Ooh, that's pretty. The language of symbols, drawings, and maps used by the Great Circle proved easy to simulate at the level of development then reached by man. In 200 years, we were able to use translation machines to converse with the planetary systems of the nearest stars and to receive and transmit whole pictures of the very life of different worlds. We recently received an answer from the 14 planets of Deneb, a first magnitude star and tremendous center of life in the Cygnus. It is 122 parsecs distant from us and radiates as much light as 4,800 of our suns. Intellectual development there has proceeded on different lines, but has reached a very high level. Strange pictures and symbols come from immeasurable distances, from the ancient worlds, from the globular clusters of our galaxy, and from the huge inhabited area around the galactic center. But we do not understand them and have not yet deciphered them. They have been recorded by the memory machines and passed on to the Academy of the Bounds of Knowledge, an institution that works on problems that our science can as yet only hint at. We're trying to understand ideas that are far from us, millions of years ahead of us, ideas that differ very differently from ours due to life there having followed different paths of development. Veda Khan turned away from the screen into which she had been staring as though hypnotized and cast an inquiring glance at Dar Vetter. He smiled and nodded his head in approval. Veda proudly raised her head, stretched out her arm to those invisible and unknown beings who would receive her words in the image 13 years later. Such is our history. Such is the difficult, devious, and lengthy ascent we have made to the heights of knowledge. We appeal to you, join us in the great circle, to carry to the ends of the tremendous universe the gigantic power of the intellect. Veda's voice had a triumphant sound to it, as though it was filled with the strength of all the generations of the people of Earth who had reached such heights that they now aspire to send their thoughts beyond the bounds of their own galaxy to other stellar islands in the universe. The bronze gong sounded as Dar Vetter turned over the lever that switched off the stream of transmitted energy. The screen went dark. The luminescent column of the conductor channel remained on the transparent panel on the right. Veda, tired and subdued, curled up in the depth of her armchair. Dar Vetter turned the control desk over to Mivin Mas and leaned over his shoulder to watch him at work. The absolute silence was broken only by the faint clicks of switches opening and closing. Suddenly, the screen in the gold frame disappeared and its place was taken by unbelievable depth of space. It was the first time that Veda Khan had seen this marvel, and she gasped loudly. Even those well acquainted with the method of the complex interference of light waves, by means of which his exceptional expanse and depth of vision was achieved, found the spectacle amazing. The dark surface of another planet was advancing from the distance, growing in size with every second. It belonged to an extraordinarily rare system of binary stars in which two suns so balanced each other that the planet had a regular orbit and life was able to emerge in it. The two suns, orange and crimson, were smaller than ours, and they lit up the ice of a frozen sea that appeared crimson in color. A huge squat building standing on the edge of a chain of flat-topped black hills were visible through a mysterious violet haze. The center of vision was focused on a platform on the roof, and then seemed to penetrate the building until the watchers saw a gray-skinned man with round eyes like those of an owl, surrounded by a fringe of silvery down. He was very tall and exceedingly thin, with tentacle-like limbs. The man jerked his head ridiculously as though he were making a hurried bow, turned listless, lens-like eyes to the screen, and opened a lipless mouth that was covered by a flap of soft flesh that looked like a nose. Zaf Fithit, Director of External Relations of 61 Cygni. Today, we're transmitting for Yellow Star STL 3388 plus 04JF. We are transmitting for, came the gentle, melodious voice of the translation machine. Dar Vetter and Junius Antus exchanged glances, and Mivin Mas squeezed Dar Vetter's wrist for a second. That was a galactic call sign of Earth, or rather of the entire solar system. The observers in other worlds have formerly regarded as one big planet rotating around the sun once in 59 terrestrial years. Once in that period, Jupiter and Saturn are in opposition, which displays the sun in the visible sky of other systems sufficiently for astronomers on the nearest stars to observe. Our astronomers made the same mistake in respect of many planetary systems that a number of stars had long been known to possess. Junius Antis checked up on the tuning of his memory machine with greater celerity than he has shown at the beginning of the transmission, and also checked the watchful accuracy indicators. The unchanging voice of the electron translator continued. We have received a transmission from star, again, a long series of figures and staccato sounds. By chance, and not during the great circle transmission times, they have not deciphered the language of the circle and are wasting energy transmitting during the hours of silence. We answered them during the transmission period, and the result will be known in 0.3 of a second. The voice broke off. The signal lamps continued to burn with the exception of the green electric guide that had gone out. We get these unexplained interruptions in transmission, perhaps due to the passage of the astronauts' legendary neural fields between us, Junius Antis explained to Veda. 0.3 of a galactic second? That means waiting 600 years, muttered Darveder morosely. A lot of good that would do us. I wonder what a galactic second is based off of. As far as I can understand, they are in communication with Epsilon Tucani in the southern sky that is 90 parsecs away from us and close to the limit of our regular communication. So far, we haven't established contact with anything farther away than Deneb, Vivimas remarked. But we receive the galactic center and the globular clusters, don't we? Asked Veda Khan. Irregularly, quite by chance, or through the memory machines of other members of the Great Circle that form a circuit stretching through the galaxy, answered Vivimas. Communications sent out thousands, even tens of thousands years ago, do not get lost in space, but eventually reach us, said Junius Antis. So that means we get a picture of the life and knowledge of the peoples of other distant worlds with great delay for the central zone of the galaxy. For example, a delay of about 20,000 years? Yes, it doesn't matter whether they are the records of the memory machines of other nearer worlds or whether they're received by our stations we see the distant worlds, as they were a very long time ago. We see people that have long been dead and forgotten in their own worlds. How is it that we are helpless in this field when we have achieved such great power over nature? Veda Khan asked petulantly. Why can't we find some other means of contacting distant worlds, something not connected with waves or photon ray equipment? How well I understand you, Veda, exclaimed Vivimas. The Academy of the Bounds of Knowledge is engaged in projects to overcome space, time, and gravity, Darveder put in. They're working on the fundamentals of the cosmos, but they have not yet got even as far as the experimental stage and cannot... The green eye suddenly flashed on again, and Veda once more felt giddy as the screen opened out into endless space. The sharply outlined edges of the image showed that it was a record of a memory machine and not a transmission received directly. At first, the onlookers saw the surface of the planet, obviously seen from an outer station and satellite. The huge pale violet sun, spectral to terrific heat generated, deluged the cloud envelope of the planet's atmosphere with its penetrating rays. Yes, that's it. The luminary of the planet is Epsilon Tucani, a high-temperature star class B superscript 9, 78 times as bright as our sun, whispered Vivimas. Darveder and Junius Antis nodded in agreement. The spectacle changed. The scene grew narrower and seemed to be descending to the very soil of the unknown world. The rounded domes of hills that looked as though they had been cast from bronze rose high above the surrounding country. An unknown stone or metal glowed like fire in the amazingly white light of the blue sun. Even in the imperfect apparatus used for transmission, the unknown world gleamed triumphantly with a sort of victorious magnificence. The reflected rays produced a silver-pink corona around the contours of the copper-colored hills and lay in a wide path of the slowly moving waves of violet sea. The water, a deep amethyst color, seemed heavy and glowed from within with red lights that looked like an accumulation of living eyes. The waves washed the massive pedestal of a gigantic statue that stood in splendid isolation far from the coast. It was a female figure carved from a dark red stone, the head thrown back and the arms extended in ecstasy towards the flaming depth of the sky. She could easily have been a daughter of Earth. The resemblance she bore to her people was no less astounding than the amazing beauty of the carving. Her body was a fulfillment of an earthly sculptor's dream. It combined great strength with inspiration in every line. The polished red stone of the statue emitted the flames of an unknown and consequently mysterious and attractive life. The five people of Earth gazed in silence at that astounding new world. The only sound was a prolonged sigh that escaped the lips of Vivimas, whose every nerve had been strained in joyful anticipation from his first glance at the statue. On the seacoast opposite the statue, carved Silver towers marked the beginning of a wide, white staircase that swept broadly over a thicket of stately trees with turquoise leaves. They ought to ring, Darvetter whispered in Beta's ear, pointing to the towers, and she nodded her head in agreement. The camera of the new planet continued its consistent and soundless journey into the country. For a second, the five people saw white walls with wide cornices through which led a portal of blue stone. The screen carried them into a high room filled with strong light. The dull pearl-colored grooved walls lent unusual clarity to everything in the hall. The attention of the Earth Dwellers attracted a group of people standing before a polished emerald panel. The flame-red color of their skin was similar to that of the statue in the sea. It was not an unusual color for Earth. Color photographs have been preserved from the ancient days, recorded some tribes of the Indians in Central America whose skin was almost the same color, perhaps just a little lighter. There were 2 men and 2 women in the hall. They stood in pairs wearing different clothing. The pair standing closer to the emerald panel were short golden clothes, something like elegant overalls, fastened with a number of clips. The other pair wore cloaks that covered them from head to foot and were of the same pearl tone as the walls. Those standing before the panel made some graceful movements, touching some strings stretched diagonally from the left-hand edge of the panel. The walls of polished emerald or glass became transparent, and in time, with the movements of the man and woman, clearly defined pictures appeared in the crystal. They appeared and disappeared so quickly that even such trained observers as Junius Antis and Darvetter had difficulty in following the meaning of them. In the procession of copper-colored mountains, violet seas, and amethyst trees, the history of the planet emerged. A chain of animal and life a chain of animal plant forms, sometimes monstrously incomprehensible, sometimes beautiful, appeared as ghosts of the past. Many of the animals and plants seemed to be similar to those that had been preserved as the records of rocks on Earth. It was a long ladder of ascending forms of life, the ladder of developing living matter. The endlessly long path of development seemed even longer, more difficult, and more tortuous than the path of evolution known to every Earth dweller. New pictures flashed through the phantom gleam of the apparatus, the flames of huge fires piled up rocks on the plains, fights with savage beasts, the solemn rites of funerals and religious services. The figure of a man covered by a motley cloak of colored skins filled the whole panel. Leaning on a spear with one hand and raising the other towards the stars in an all-bracing gesture, he stood with his foot on the neck of a conquered monster with a ridge of stiff hair down his back and long bare fangs. In the background, a line of men and women had joined hands in pairs and seemed to be singing something. The picture faded away, and the place of the tablets was taken by a dark surface of polished stone. At this moment, the pair in gold, in golden clothing moved away to the right, and their place was taken by the second pair. With a movement so rapid that the eye could not follow it, the cloaks were thrown aside, and the two dark red bodies gleamed like living fire against the pearl of the walls. The man held out his hands to the woman, and she answered him with such a proud and dazzling smile of joy that the Earth Dwellers responded with involuntary smiles. And there in the pearl hall of that immeasurably distant world, the two people began a slow dance. It was probably not dance for the sake of dancing, but it was something more in the nature of Eurythmics, in which the dancers strove to show their perfection, the beauty of the lines, and the flexibility of their bodies. A majestic and at the same time sorrowful music could be felt in the rhythmic change of movement, as though recalling the great ladder of countless unnamed victims sacrificed to the development of life that had produced man, that beautiful and intelligent being. Beauty plus intellect, indeed. Megan wrote that. Yeah, agreed there. Mevin Mass fancied he could hear a melody, a movement in pure high tones played against the background of the resonant and measured rhythm of low notes. Vedakon squeezed Darvetter's hand, but the latter did not pay her any attention. Junius Antis stood motionless toward the scene. Junius Antis stood motionless, watching the scene, without even breathing, and beads of perspiration stood out on his broad forehead. The people of the Tukani planet were so like the people of Earth that the impression of another world was gradually lost. The red people, however, possessed bodies of refined beauty, such as not by that time being universally achieved on Earth, but which lived in the dreams and the creations of artists and was to be seen only in a small number of unusually beautiful people. The more difficult and the longer the path of blind animal evolution up the thinking being, the more purposeful and perfected are the higher forms of life, and therefore the more beautiful, thought Darvetter. The people of Earth realized a long time ago that beauty is an instinctively comprehended purposefulness of structure that is adapted to definite objectives. The more varied the objectives, the more beautiful the form. These red people must be more versatile and agile than we are. Perhaps their civilization has progressed mainly through the development of man himself, the development of his spiritual and physical might, rather than through technical development. Even with the coming of communist society, our civilization has remained fundamentally technical, and only in the era of common labor did we turn to the perfection of man himself and not only his machines, houses, food, and amusements. That gives a lot of food for thought, actually. Says, I think in our modern day and age, yeah, you're right. There's a lot of focus on material things, not so much on the spiritual development. Okay, commentary aside, moving on. The dance was over. The young red-skinned woman came into the center of the hall, and the camera of the transmitter focused on her alone. Her outstretched arms and her face were tuned to the ceiling of the hall. The eyes of the Earth dwellers involuntarily followed her glance. There was no ceiling, or perhaps some clever optical illusion created an impression of a night sky with very large and bright stars. The strange combination of constellations did not arouse any association. The girl waved her hand, and a blue ball appeared on the index finger of her left hand. A silvery ray streamed out of the ball and served her as a gigantic pointer. A round patch of light at the end of the pointer halted first on one, then another star in the ceiling. In each case, the emerald panel showed a motionless picture extremely wide in scale. As the pointer ray moved from star to star, the panel demonstrated a series of inhabited and uninhabited planets. Joyless and sorrowful were the stone or sand deserts that burned in the rays of red, blue, violet, and yellow suns. Sometimes the rays of a strange leaden gray star would bring to life on its planets flattened domes or spirals permeated with electricity that swam like jellyfish in a dense orange atmosphere or ocean. In the world of the red sun, there grew trees of incredible height with slimy black bark, trees that stretched their millions of crooked branches heavenward as though in despair. Other planets were completely covered with dark water. Huge living islands, either animal or vegetable, were floating everywhere, the countless hairy feelers waving over the smooth surfaces of the water. They have no planets near them that possess the higher forms of light, said Junius Antis suddenly, without once taking his eyes off the star map of the unknown sky. Yes, they have, said Darvetter, although the flattened stellar system to one side of them is one of the newest formations in the galaxy. We know that flattened and globular systems, the old and the new, not infrequently alternate. In the direction of Eridanus, there is a system with living intelligences that belong to the circle. VVR 4955 plus MO 3529 ... etc., added Mivamass. But why don't they know of it? The system entered the Great Circle 275 years ago, and this communication was made before that, answered Darvetter. The red-skinned girl from the distant world shook the blue ball from her finger and turned to face her audience. Her arms stretched out widely as though to embrace some invisible person standing before her. She threw back her head and shoulders as a woman of earth would in a burst of passion. Her mouth was half open, and her lips moved as she repeated inaudible words. So she stood, immobile, appealing, sending forth into the cold darkness of interspace fiery human words of an entreaty for friendship with people of other words. Again, her enthralling beauty held the earth dwellers spellbound. She had nothing of the bronze severity of the red-skinned people of Earth. Her round face, small nose, and big, widely placed blue eyes bore more resemblance to the northern people of Earth. Her thick, wavy black hair was not stiff. Every line of her face and body expressed a slight and joyful confidence that came from a subconscious feeling of great strength. I think there's a definite preference there for European styles of beauty here. I mean, very clearly. It's a little biased, that's for sure. But then again, he is European, Ivan Yefremov. Okay. Is it possible that they know nothing of the Great Circle? Veda Khan almost groaned, as though in obscience before her beautiful sister from the cosmos. By now they probably know, answered Darvetter. The scenes we have witnessed date 300 years back. 88 parsecs, rumbled Mivamass's low voice. 88. All those people we have just seen have long been dead. As though in confirmation of his words, the scene from the wonderful world disappeared, and the green indicator went out. The transmission around the Great Circle was over. For another minute, they were all in a trance. The first to recover was Dar Vetter. Biting his lip in chagrin, he hurriedly turned the granulated lever. The column of directed energy switched off with the sound of a gong that warned power station engineers to redirect the gigantic stream of energy into its usual channels. The director of the outer stations turned back to his companions only when all the necessary manipulations had been completed. Junius Antis, with a frown on his face, was looking through pages of written notes. Some of the memory records taken down from the stellar map on the ceiling must be sent to the Southern Sky Institute, he said, turning to Darvetter's young assistant. That latter looked at Junius Antis in amazement, as though he had just awakened from an unusual dream. The grim scientist looked at him, a smile lurking in his eyes. What they had seen was indeed a dream of a wonderful world sent out into space 300 years before, a dream that thousands of millions of people on Earth and in the colonies on the Moon, Mars, and Venus would now see so clearly that it would be almost tangible. You're right, Mivamass, smiled Darvetter. When you said before the transmission began that something unusual was going to happen today, for the first time in the 800 years since we joined the Great Circle, a planet has appeared in the universe inhabited by beings who are our brothers, not only in intellect, but in body as well. You can well imagine my joy at this discovery. Your tour of duty as director has begun auspiciously. In the old days, people would have said it was a lucky sign, and our present day psychologists would say that coincidental events have occurred that favor confidence and give you encouragement in your further work. Darvetter stopped suddenly. Nervous reaction had made him more verbose than usual. In the era of the Great Circle, verbosity was considered one of the most disgraceful failings possible in a man. The director of the outer station stopped without finishing a sentence. Yes, responded Mivamass absent-mindedly. Junius Antis noticed the sluggishness in his voice and in his movements. He was immediately on alert. Vedakon quietly ran her finger along Darvetter's hand and nodded toward the African. Perhaps he is too impressionable? Wondered Darvetter, staring fixedly at his successor. Mivamass sensed the concealed surprise of his companions. He straightened up and became his usual self, an attentive and skilled performer of the task in hand. An escalator took them to the upper stories of the building, where there were extensive looking out at the starry sky that was again as far away as it had always been during the whole 30,000 years of man's existence, or rather the existence of that species of humanoids known as Homo sapiens. Mivamass and Darvetter had to remain behind. Vedakon whispered to Darvetter that she would never forget that night. It made me feel so insignificant, she said in conclusion, her face beaming despite her sorrowful words. Darvetter knew what she meant and shook her head. I'm sure that if the Red Woman had seen you, she would have been proud of her, Sister Veda. Surely our Earth isn't a bit worse than their planet. Darvetter's face was glowing with the light of love. Aw, that's so beautiful. Glowing with the light of love. That's seen through your eyes, my friend, smiled Veda. But ask Mivamass what he thinks. Jokingly, she covered his eyes with her hand and then disappeared around a corner of the wall. When Mivamass was the last left alone, it was already morning. A grayish light was breaking through the cool, still air, and the sky and the sea were alike in the crystal transparency, the sea silver and the sky pinkish. For a long time, the Africans stood on the balcony of the observatory, gazing at the still unfamiliar outlines of the buildings. On a low plateau in the distance rose a huge aluminum arch crossed by 9 parallel aluminum bars, the spaces between them filled with yellowish cream and silvery plastic glass. This was the building of the Astronautical Council. Before the building stood a monument to the first people to enter outer space. The steep slope of a mountain reaching into clouds and whirlwinds was mounted by an old-type spaceship, a fish-shaped rocket that pointed its sharp nose into still unattainable heights. Cast metal figures supporting each other in a chain were making a superhuman effort to climb upwards, spiraling their way around the base of the monument. These were the pilots of the rocket ships, the physicists, astronomers, biologists, and writers with bold imaginations. The whole of the old spaceship and the light lattice work of the council building were painted red by the dawn, but still Mivamass continued pacing up and down the balcony. Never before had he met with such a shock. He had been brought up according to the general education rules of the Great Circle era, had a hard physical training, and had successfully performed his labors of Hercules, the difficult task performed by every young person at the end of his schooling that had been given this name in honor of ancient Greece. If a youngster performed these tasks successfully, he was considered worthy to storm the heights of higher education. Mivamass had worked in the construction of the water supply system of a mine in western Tibet, on the restoration of the Araucaria pine forest on the Nahayat now had been plateauing in South America and had taken part in annihilation of the sharks that again appeared off the coast of Australia. His training, his heredity, and his outstanding abilities enabled him to undertake many years of persistent study to prepare himself for difficult and responsible activities. On that day, during the first hour of his new work, there had been a meeting with a world that was related to our Earth, and that had brought something new to his heart. With alarm, Mivimas felt that some great depth had opened up within him, something whose existence he had never even suspected. How he craved for another meeting with the planet of star Epsilon in the Tucana constellation. That was a world that seemed to have come into being by power of the best legends known to the Earth dwellers. He would never forget the red-skinned girl, her outstretched, alluring arms, her tender, half-open lips. The fact that 290 light years dividing him from that marvelous world was a distance that could not be covered by any means known to the technicians of Earth served to strengthen rather than weaken his dream. Something new had grown up in Mevin's heart, something that lived its own life and did not submit to the control of the will and cold intellect. The African had never been in love. He had been absorbed in his work almost as a hermit would be, and had never experienced anything like the alarm and incomparable joy that had entered his heart during that meeting across a tremendous barrier of love and a tremendous barrier of space and time. And Megan wrote here love, and I agree. It's pretty obvious. He fell in love with this girl, or this woman, just from the transmission across space and time. 300 light years away, which means it took like 300 years to get there. About. Oh man, this is actually really interesting. Like sociological discussions as well of basically utopian society. Yes, the distances that still prevent us, despite how futuristic we are. I don't know. I think, in a way, I'm liking this book more than this other one. So yeah, I just briefly mentioned it. This other one, Omen Ra by Viktor Palavin, contemporary Russian author. Very interesting book, this one. I read it a lot faster than Andromeda, but to be frank, I've kind of felt, I don't know, some sadness and sort of a heavy feeling after finishing reading this. Andromeda, though, I'm reading it, and I feel, so far, I've been feeling like a bittersweet feeling. Like, it's mostly optimistic. So, this chapter, by the way, did have an illustration, I think, if I can find it. So this was like chapter 2, and it had a beautiful little picture here. Some balance. I guess that's the picture of the beta, like basically showing the worlds what was going on, like reading the passages. That ancient outfit, the sign of great beauty, apparently. So, all right, that only took about an hour. I mean, I think read from page 37 to page 67. So that was 41 pages with some light commentary from me. So if you, I don't know, if you like my commentaries, let me know. Perhaps if you're watching this. Either way, I mean, hopefully you got something out of it. I don't really know anybody else who's actively reading this book online to a public audience. Definitely not anybody who makes random commentaries like me. So, all right, I'll see if I can read another chapter in a little bit, but I got to take a break for now. So, yeah.